Hello and welcome to today's webinar sponsored by EcoAct, How to Talk to Your C-Suite About Carbon Offsets. I'm Jake Mitchell, Director of Climate Tech Innovation at Trellis, and I'm pleased as always to welcome listeners from around the world. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, I want to let you know a few housekeeping details. This webinar platform has a number of features. As shown on the slide, you can resize and move around the various windows on the webinar platform to optimize your viewing experience. On the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar with various buttons, and you can download the resources from today's webinar by clicking on the button marked Resources. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with all registrants later today. And if you have questions for today's speakers, simply click on the Q&A button and type your question into the Q&A window that appears. We'll be fielding those questions a little later on in this program, but don't hesitate to ask along the way. And you can also chat with each other, other attendees at any time by clicking the group chat button. Finally, feel free to share what you're learning with your social networks by tagging us at Trellis. And now on to today's discussion. As the urgency to meet net zero goals grows, organizations are grappling with how to balance decarbonization efforts with the strategic use of carbon offsets. This session will provide a practical forward-looking framework for building a high-integrity offset strategy that supports your emissions reductions roadmap. And today, the discussion will be broken into three parts. First, we'll begin exploring why strong internal communication is key to aligning stakeholders, building trust, and gaining momentum for your offset initiatives. Next, we'll dive into the essential elements, the what, of a credible offset strategy, covering topics like quality and claims making. And finally, the third part will share insights from real-world implementation, highlighting what it takes to put these strategies into practice within large organizations. Joining me today are Yue Cho, Head of Advisory, North America at EcoAct. We have Matt Alexander, Senior Consultant at EcoAct, and Natalie Stubb, Net Zero Strategy Lead at Cisco. Grateful to have you all here with us today. Thank you for joining. And now to kick us off, I'll pass it to Yue to start with the why. Over to you, Yue.
Thank you, Jake, and thank you for having me on this webinar. I want to first give you all a brief introduction. EcoAct is part of Schneider Electric's global sustainability business. Across our network, we are over 3,500 sustainability consultants and experts working with more than 3,000 clients around the world. We work across strategy to execution, helping organizations calculate their carbon footprints, set science-based targets, define credible net zero roadmaps, understand the role carbon credits play in that journey, develop renewable energy strategies, and also support their energy procurement and implementation plan. My role within the organization focuses on serving our North American market, supporting companies every step along the way towards the net zero future, which takes a good bit of science and evidence-based analysis plus storytelling, sprinkled in a small amount of preaching, some arm twisting, which I suspect might resonate with those on the call today. So if you're wondering how to get your CFO or CEO to take carbon offsetting seriously, you're definitely not alone, and you're definitely not too early. I want to first start with the big picture. We've known for a while now that we need to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees to avoid the most destabilizing impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, when we read the news every week and every year, we hear that we're far from realizing that vision. The UN EP emissions gap report published earlier this year showed that even if every country hit their current NDCs, and that is nationally determined contributions, we'd still be on track for well over 2 degrees of warming. And closing that gap is going to require every tool we have. We need countries to ratchet up their ambition in the NDCs, and we critically also need to accelerate climate action from the private sector. We can't afford to rely on just one set of tools, which is a message that you will hear echoed a number of times in this webinar. Stepping back into 2014, the Science Based Targets Initiative was formed then, and I would argue at that time, at least partially as a response to stalled policy progress. providing a way to empower companies to lead in climate action. And since then, we've seen 8,000 or more than 8,000 companies set and validate their science-based targets, committing to a substantial amount of emission reductions over the next 5 to 10 years. The commitments are starting to translate into real-world impact. For example, corporate demand for renewables has accelerated the build-out of clean energy infrastructure in ways that policy alone could not, driving procurement from just 1.5 gigawatt in 2015 to 10 gigawatt in 2020. However, and this next part is critical in setting the stage of why we're having this conversation today. What we have seen happening on the ground is still not quite enough. Over half of the companies with science-based targets highlight technological uncertainty as a potential barrier to achieving the targets that they have set. Even those with ambitious goals are now confronting questions like what happens when supply chain emissions remain challenging or near impossible to reduce? What if low carbon technologies don't scale fast enough? And what if there's no clear path to get all the way or close to net zero? So this is where carbon credits, both ones from avoidance and removals, enter the conversation. And importantly, we need to recognize them not as a shortcut or a substitute for real reductions, but as a strategic tool in a broader and bigger, more impactful net zero toolkit. To give an order of magnitude, all IPCC AR6 pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees rely on carbon removal, averaging 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal per year from now until 2100. And that's not a marginal amount of contribution, and it's a level that we're very far from today. Well, carbon avoidance isn't broken out in IPCC pathways explicitly the way removals are. It does underpin the near-term emission reductions those models rely on and addresses the most urgent need, which is to keep emissions from rising. Give us a little bit more time as technology for removals continue to build and scale. So taking emissions reduction, carbon avoidance, carbon removal all together, we're not choosing one approach over another. It's about building a portfolio that delivers real climate value across the short, medium, and long term. So a piece for those on the call, when you speak to leaders in the business, we need to remind them that we cannot afford to wait for a perfect solution. And we absolutely need to scale every critical pathway to net zero today. And you see on the right-hand side, very importantly, the SBTI, the original instigator for propelling corporate climate action, in its draft V2 net zero guidance affirms that while companies must prioritize emission reduction, they can also engage with high-quality carbon credits to address emissions, especially in the transition period. Companies are still encouraged to reduce as much as possible, but at the same time also to explore complementary investments in high-quality carbon removals and avoidance where appropriate, especially when technological barriers or time constraints limit near-term reductions. We should address the elephant in the room. It is very much fair and even prudent for corporate leaders to be a little cautious about the voluntary carbon market. We have seen a number of negative coverage in the press, and some carbon credit claims have not held up to scrutiny. And no company wants to risk being accused of greenwashing today. A WBCSD-led survey found that 44% of business leaders cite greenwashing concerns as their top hesitation when it comes to carbon credit use. And here, I would argue that this is where leadership matters, because caution with the voluntary carbon market should lead to more due diligence as opposed to total disengagement. When we look at data from a 2023 report from Ecosystem Marketplace, companies purchasing carbon credits tend to be the ones already committed to decarbonizing. They're more likely to invest in energy efficiency, have low carbon energy consumption, have an approved science-based target, and already address value chain emissions. So the narrative that companies use credits instead of reducing their own emissions doesn't hold up, and it's actually quite the opposite. They tend to be the ones doing more and not less. The question we should pose isn't whether carbon credits are risky, but whether more companies are using them transparently, credibly, in addition to direct reductions. Now, having said that, still only a very small fraction of companies are participating at all in this market today. And I want to dig into that a little bit on the next slide. Carbon credit purchases are increasing, which is the good news, but the overall base is still very small. In 2024, the number of companies active in the voluntary carbon market doubled compared to 2022, which may sound impressive until you think about the millions of companies operate globally and how few of them are engaged in the market in a meaningful way today. When we zoom in on who is buying, the concentration is even more stark. You can see on these graphs, the market is dominated by a handful of large players. Just 10 of them were responsible for over half of all carbon credit retirements in 2024. And when you look at the purchase of carbon removal credits, or carbon dioxide removal CDRs, which is the long-term side of the market compared to compensation, Microsoft alone accounts for 83% of all technical removals purchased to date. And that's a signal that this market, while growing, is still fundamentally underdeveloped, especially relative to the size and urgency of the climate challenge. And here's an important point for those on the webinar today. As sustainability leaders try to educate out and up in the organization, and as more companies begin to pursue net zero targets, demand for high quality credits is going to outpace supply. And because high integrity credit projects take years to develop, we won't be available, or they won't be available at scale unless companies start signaling demand now. So the buyers today are helping to scale the market, and on the flip side, those who wait too long might find themselves without options or paying a significant premium for credits when they're racing towards 2030 or 2040 target. So this piece around supply and demand, around strategic positioning, it certainly warrants bringing forward to senior leaders in the business. And before we close out the why question, I want to give one more dimension to the answer. We're at a turning point in the voluntary carbon market. I've heard people say that the VCM is growing up, and I'm not just talking about the volume of credits being retired. This is not quote unquote the Wild West of offsetting anymore. There are now clear guardrails, more rigorous standards, and much more scrutiny. The ICVCM has introduced its core carbon principles, which define what counts as high integrity credit. The Oxford Principles provide guidance on how credits should be used over time with an increasing shift towards removals. And jurisdictions like California are implementing disclosure laws, such as AB 1305, that require companies to be transparent about the credits they use and the claims they make. It is important to understand that the voluntary carbon market is evolving as we speak, with more project methodologies being reviewed for ICVCM CCP eligibility each month, and buyers can now enter the market with more confidence and clearer rules. So to close out the first part of the webinar, timing is everything. Number one, climate science tells us the window to act is closing. Delayed action means higher costs, fewer options, and it's important to remember that delaying engagement doesn't actually buy us time. It simply shrinks the options that we have. So we need to act now, including through carbon finance. Number two, market momentum is building and competition will follow. We're approaching an inflection point in demand. As more companies engage, we expect credit prices to rise and supply to tighten, especially for those of high quality and high integrity. The early movers will have more choice, more credibility, and better economics. The third timing signal is regulatory and reputational. Standards and rules are changing fast. From voluntary guidance to legal disclosure requirements, the expectations are evolving, and those who choose disengagement and wait will find themselves caught off guard. So I hope this arms you with some talking points to bring to your executives, whether via IM, email, or when you're running to them in the hallway. Jake, I'm happy to pause here and take maybe one initial question.
Thank you, Yue. Thanks for this comprehensive breakdown on the why behind carbon offsets. Yeah, and this question I'm going to ask you just quickly might be kind of leading into the what behind it, but I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
Your opinion. If a company, let's say, has $100,000 to invest in something, when should they prioritize voluntary carbon credits over direct emissions reductions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you're using the term prioritization as opposed to which one to pick, right? Because as I said earlier, we need all the tools in the toolkit. We need to scale every possible pathway. Now, $100,000 is not a lot of money. So the answer to that question, I would say, depends on where the $100,000 can create the most immediate additional climate impact, as well as strategic value to the business. So a rule of thumb, I would say if an organization already has identified high impact and low cost internal reductions, like energy efficiency upgrades, material switching, supplier switching, the company should absolutely prioritize those first. Right? When we think about the carbon savings per dollar spent, I've heard people say, roughly $100 is the threshold, right? If something is significantly more expensive to decarbonize today because of lack of technology scalability, then if you wait a year, the cost might go down, and that finance could be unlocked for other purposes. If your emission reductions are capital intensive or slow moving, you want to start contributing to climate progress now, you can allocate some or all of that $100,000 to high integrity carbon credits.
Perfect. Thank you, Yue. Thanks for that, added context. And if you have questions for Yue based on what she just shared in the presentation or that mini Q&A, throw it in the chat and we'll get to it later. So now on to the what portion. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Jay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Perfect.
All right. So I'm going to focus on what you should talk about to your C-suite when it comes to carbon offsetting. And, a fundamental step is grounding your leadership and why carbon credits matter, just as Yue took us through. Carbon credits are increasingly recognized, not just as a tool for compensation, but as a powerful lever for broader climate action. And investing in carbon credits can unlock private finance for climate solutions that can be deployed today, especially in parts of the world where this kind of funding is desperately needed. Carbon credits also offer a way to go beyond internal decarbonization and address residual emissions. And participating in the voluntary carbon market doesn't have to be just about carbon. These projects often address other sustainable development goals and can support wider commitments your company may have, such as supporting biodiversity, human health, and more, meaning that you shouldn't just view carbon offsetting as a cost, but as a means of driving value for your business and generating long-term credibility when done appropriately. So how do you approach carbon offsetting in a way that stands up to scrutiny? It's imperative that your C-suite understands what it will take to ensure your strategy is not just symbolic, but measurable, credible, and future-proof. And we've identified 4 guiding principles to achieve this. First, offsetting cannot be a substitute for action, as Yue touched on. Your C-suite should be prepared to demonstrate long-term vision by clearly communicating your climate goals and how you intend to balance decarbonization efforts with carbon offsetting. Even more important is documenting progress against these goals over time. Second, your C-suite should be prepared to prioritize investment in high-quality carbon credits. This means establishing clear credit selection criteria, leveraging thorough due diligence processes through internal capacity building or finding the right partner to support you, and being willing to allocate a budget for carbon offsetting that goes beyond the bare minimum and ensures you are investing in the right types of credits for your business. Third, we already talked about this as well. Your C-suite should be prepared to maximize transparency. That means detailing your carbon footprint and owning it, how and why you are offsetting, the specific projects you're investing in, the standards or the frameworks your climate commitments are aligned to. This will build trust and with your stakeholders and align with the disclosure frameworks Yue previously touched on. And underpinning all of this is a need to always be mindful of the regulatory considerations that may impact your strategy and to proactively build around those constraints. For example, if you are operating in the air freight space, your strategy will be dictated primarily by the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, or CORSIA. Or if you're planning to make claims about your business or products in the EU, you will need to be mindful of the evolving landscape around the Green Claims Directive. Alongside these guiding principles, it's also important to keep in mind several common pitfalls you'll need to navigate with your executives in order to avoid non-credible offsetting claims. These can include considerations at the corporate strategy level, such as relying too heavily on carbon offsets in lieu of efforts to reduce emissions, or offsetting only a subset of your emissions. And claims associated with these types of strategies may be perceived as misleading or insincere to your stakeholders, opening you up to reputational or even regulatory risk. And then there are also considerations that are tied to the specific carbon credits you're using to make your claims. Carbon credits may be scrutinized if there are questions around their additionality, whether double counting has occurred, their verification status, or simply not generating the outcomes that were promised. And we've seen media headlines focus on these types of issues. And while efforts in recent years are improving the voluntary carbon market's integrity, as you already mentioned, there are still inherent risks associated with engaging in the VCM, and it's important to be mindful of these factors to set yourselves up for success in mitigating your exposure to those risks. So how do you navigate these challenges and build a robust and tactical offsetting strategy? Our work supporting clients typically focuses on three key variables fundamental to communicating your offsetting strategy to leadership and enabling confident engagement in the voluntary carbon market. First, we focus on determining the volume of carbon credits that will be required each year. And this is directly influenced by your ambition and the types of commitments you want to set. This ties back to my previous point on establishing your long-term vision, which will inform your decarbonization trajectory, your future emissions profile, and the amount of carbon credits you will need to achieve your goals. For example, a company that has set SBTi net zero targets may not require as many carbon credits if they are comfortable steadily ramping up their purchases over time until they make a net zero claim. However, another company with SBTi net zero targets may also be interested in taking greater action on the road to net zero, compensating for its emissions to make an interim claim like VCMI Gold or Platinum, which would require a much greater volume of carbon credits to be retired. And a third company may not even have net zero targets and instead be pursuing carbon neutrality in its operations according to the ISO carbon neutrality standard, which would again entail a different approach to offsetting and unique credit volume requirements. So going through this process and establishing your vision, your commitments, your goals will lay the foundation for the volume of credits that you need to consider. Second, we focus on determining the types of credits you want to invest in. And there are many factors that could play into your preferences for project selection, including geography to align with your operating locations, co-benefits to align with your mission, such as human health for a pharmaceutical company, credit costs that may rule out certain types of novel project technologies like direct air capture, and more. And on top of those considerations, we lean into a risk-based decision-making process, breaking down how one unit of a carbon credit can differ from another in terms of its risk profile, quality, and market status. For example, mangrove restoration projects will generally have a different risk profile than refrigerant destruction projects because they're tackling two different problems in our world. And when you consider factors like additionality, permanence, quantification methodologies, the costs of these projects, the co-benefits achieved, whether they're applicable to the type of commitments you've set, for example, avoidance credits versus removal credits. There are a lot of considerations, and each type of project may carry pros and cons depending on your specific context and preferences. So it's critical to take a risk-based approach to selecting the types of projects you build into your portfolio and align with your mission, criteria, and risk tolerance. But I also want to emphasize that your decision-making process should not stop at the project category level. While projects within the same category may share a common risk profile, due diligence at the individual project level is really critical. And you might have a project in a higher risk category that's been designed really well and it solves the potential risk factors at play. Meanwhile, a project in a lower risk category may be executed poorly and lead to unexpected risk factors. The third point I want to make is, focusing on determining the way you want to procure carbon credits. And this unpacks the various procurement options available in the market today and their respective advantages and drawbacks. For example, annual spot market purchases are much more flexible and they allow you to be nimble in your offsetting strategy. But they're also, it exposes you to more price volatility or potential supply constraints. Meanwhile, longer term contractual arrangements like project investment or offtake agreements may entail larger upfront investments, but secure a pipeline of credits for a set period of time, at a set price point, and really catalyze getting certain types of projects off the ground that need that upfront financing. And so it's important to consider factors like your tolerance for price volatility, upfront capital investment, et cetera, at this stage. and evaluate your appetite and internal capacity for building and managing a portfolio at large. This will dictate how you engage the voluntary carbon market and the partners you may choose to work with. And it may necessitate bringing certain stakeholders in, like your finance and procurement teams, into these conversations. So understanding the volume of credits you need, the type of credits you want to use, and the procurement methods you want to leverage forms the basis for building and costing a carbon offsetting roadmap that you can bring to your C-suite. And I mentioned costing in particular because this is often a key decision factor for defining your strategy and gaining that internal buy-in. This will inform the budgets that may be required to achieve your goals and add another data point to your decision-making in formulating your strategy. For example, a company may start out by seeking a strategy that focuses entirely on tech-based removal credits like direct air capture to mitigate certain risks, but see the price tag associated with that approach and realize they need to pursue a more holistic and blended strategy that incorporates other types of credits in a robust and risk-adjusted manner. Financial analysis of your carbon offsetting strategy can also play an important role in internal discussions, or like setting an internal price on carbon or informing how your organization balances decarbonization efforts with carbon offsetting. By following these steps, you'll be able to develop a thoughtful, credible, and cost-effective carbon offsetting strategy to share with your C-suite. Jake, that wraps it up for me.
Thank you, Matt, for that helpful breakdown on the what and the strategy side, gaining buy-in and also seeing how to go about purchasing. Quick question for you related to the project selection side of things. One, could carbon offset projects be put at risk by climate change? And if so, how do you go about this risk exposure when purchasing carbon offsets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question, Jake. And, climate risk is a factor when thinking about carbon projects and going through that due diligence and risk management process. Certain types of projects like afforestation, depending on where those projects are located, there may be risks of fire that could, jeopardize the integrity of the project. Or, Vera has a methodology for organizations to assess sea level rise risks associated with wetlands projects. So there is a process in place to assess climate risk when these projects are being developed. And that should be a factor that organizations consider when they're deciding how to approach projects and where they want to source credits from, what kinds of projects, et cetera. And keep in mind what kind of protective and insurance mechanisms are in play to ensure those projects are, mitigating the risks appropriately.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Matt. And again, audience, I see you're putting questions. That's great. If you have more, feel free to keep dropping them in for later. Now over to the last but not least, the how section, kind of more of a case study here. Natalie, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jake. Glad to be here today with you and the EcoAct team. For the how part of this webinar, I want to talk you through Cisco's journey and show you how we moved from stated goals with strategic intent to real tangible action. And spoiler alert, right? How communicating clearly and credibly with our leadership has really been critical for us in this space. So Cisco has set a target to achieve net zero by 2040 with some interim goals focused on our operational emissions as well as a portion of our value chain emissions. Our net zero and our near-term goals are validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, which means that by 2040, we've committed to reducing our emissions by a minimum of 90%, and that we'll utilize carbon removals to neutralize any residuals. We know carbon removals are a part of achieving this goal and are therefore a part of our strategy and are really complementary to reductions and not thought of as a substitute in that space. On the left side of this slide, you're seeing a breakdown of Cisco's annual emissions from our scope 1 and 2 direct operations all the way through our value chain. What you can see is that our scope 3 emissions, and specifically the ones tied to our manufacturing, logistics, and customer use of our products, make up the vast majority of our footprint. Actually, over 98% of our annual footprint is in scope 3. And we showed this up front to our executives because it's a really clear visual and it tells the story about the importance of value chain engagement. Most of our emissions are outside of our immediate operational control, meaning that our commitments and our strategies have to extend outwards across our partners, suppliers, and customers. So where we focus the talk track with our executives here is really on risk, transparency, and value, things that the executives always love to hear about. Of course, we highlight the importance of regulatory and compliance and ESG reporting. That's foundational for meeting our public commitments and maintaining reputation. But one of the strongest narratives we found is about customer value alignment. At Cisco, many of our top customers have really ambitious climate goals, and by reducing our emissions, we're directly enabling them to meet their climate targets. This is thought of as a strategic advantage for us, and it can deepen our key client relationships, and in some cases, even open new markets. So to reinforce all of this with our C-suite, we use simple, visual, transparent data like what you're seeing on this slide. So we've noticed when the execs see progress towards goals, as well as well-outlined risk exposure in really clear charts like this, it becomes more of a business conversation, so less about the nitty-gritty science of carbon removals, which can feel sometimes technically difficult to get your arms around, and is focused more on the material impact and the opportunity for the business as a whole. Okay, so I want to shift gears here a little bit and talk about how we're approaching carbon removals at Cisco. So after we tackle as much reduction as possible, at least 90% according to our SBTI goal, we're going to look to carbon removal offsets to address those residual emissions. But as Yue and Matt have already kind of teased out here, right, like not all offsets are created equal, and we need to make sure we're investing in projects that produce high quality credits and are removing any potential, backlash from greenwashing. So on this slide, you're seeing 6 fundamental criteria that we use to assess carbon removal projects. I'll step through them quickly here. So additionality, that's where we ask ourselves, is this removal happening because of our investment and not something that would have happened without us? So I like to think about the difference between planting new trees, so something that would require investment to get those trees from seed to sapling in the ground, versus just taking credit from trees that are already planted in our neighborhood parks or in our backyards. Permanence, right, is about the duration of time the project will sequester carbon and how likely the risk of reversal is. So things like engineered removals, like direct air capture and storage, a little harder to reverse those unless there's a leak, right? Versus something like reforestation can be a little trickier because if there's any sort of clear cutting or wildfires, right, there's a little bit more of a risk of reversal. Leakage is asking if, is there a risk that this project just simply moves emissions elsewhere? An example I like to think about here is if you plant trees on land that's currently used for livestock grazing, like where are those animals going, right? Are we cutting down trees somewhere else just to make a new field for them so we can plant trees in this field? I want to think about any potential leakage of where the emissions are moving. Impact is just what it sounds like, right? Does the project create real environmental and social co-benefits? Are we doing something that the local community is excited to be part of, or is this something they're adamantly opposed to? We want to make sure that we're engaging the right folks in the areas that these projects are being developed. Verifiability, so this is about independent measuring and auditability of the credits that are produced. I think a lot of us are thinking as we see more regulation coming down from various governments, even state level, right? Like we need to make sure that our auditors can feel comfortable tracking the verifiability of these credits. And then finally on this slide, I've got double counting, which is just asking if the credits are unique and are we the only ones taking credit for them, or is there someone else like a government or maybe the project owners themselves that are counting the same credits? So these 6 have been adapted from ICVCM's core carbon principles, so you might be familiar with them already. But what I want to call out is that even though I'm only showing 6 here on the slide, this is by no means an exhaustive list of what we're evaluating when we look at a project. The reality is that there are hundreds of project types out there, nature-based work like reforestation, to engineered solutions like direct air capture, and they each have their own risks and benefits to consider. And as Matt pointed out just a few minutes ago, even within the same project type, projects can have different risk portfolios. So it's important to have a solid set of criteria that you're measuring against. Okay, so if at this point you're thinking, wow, that seems like a lot of work and a lot of things to consider, I'll tell you that we also recognize that we weren't going to be able to navigate this landscape alone. So in a shameless plug for Yue and her team on the call today, we engaged with them to help us map out the complex landscape and evaluate the full spectrum of options and understand, some nuances about different project types. So things like how prevalent a project is, how many, reforestation projects are out there, technology readiness, especially in things like direct air capture, right? Like how ready is this technology to be invested in? How likely is it to continue to be able to produce the volumes of credits that we need, as well as things around, permanence, quantification, and price point, which is another talking point that, we need to consider. But EcoAct's systematic approach really enabled us to think critically about how we could build an offset portfolio that fits our needs, our risk tolerance, and our integrity standards. In executive conversations, it's really important to have a strong foundation internally, understanding these projects on a deeper level so that we can explain those benefits, and talk to why we trust the methodology and how we've evaluated the risk before it's added to our portfolio. And this also really helps us talk about cost justification, and how we prioritize work in critical geographies. So for example, right, when the EcoAct team was helping us review some projects last year, they walked us through not only the environmental benefits, but the project, level risk of reversal, community impact, and really helping us think through whether or not these projects aligned with our company's values. So they, these little details are helping us defend our claims both internally and externally, and garnering support for the company or inside the company for the work that we're doing. So I'll just say, to sum up, when you're talking to executives about offsets, our personal MO is to keep it data-driven, customer-aligned, and focused on value both for our business and our stakeholders. So we are doing our best to translate any technical points into those just, straight business risks and opportunities, and to really anchor everything that we're doing around the company's broader strategy, as well as our customer commitments. And at least for us, we found that when we take, these conversations and make them really relevant and concrete, that we get natural buy-in. So with that, Jake, I will turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natalie, for the breakdown. And quick follow-up as well. How has Cisco balanced investing in decarbonization solutions versus investing in offsetting? How do you think about that from a strategic lens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess first and foremost, right, like we know that reductions and removals are complementary. They're not mutually exclusive. So as part of our strategy, we're really trying to take a pragmatic and future-looking approach to investment. So we're trying to balance risk, cost, compliance, all those good things. But I think for us, right, like something to consider that I didn't maybe touch on too much in this presentation, and something that Matt actually called out a minute ago, right, is that we're really being thoughtful about our geographies and how they relate to our footprint, our own operational footprint, as well as our customers and our value chains, so that we can be as impactful per dollar as possible with that investment.
Perfect. Well, thank you to our three excellent presenters, Yue, Matt, and Natalie. You all were listening when I asked to put questions in the chat, because we have a lot of good ones. So we're just gonna get right to it. And again, thank you for those questions. So this one, I'm going to start with this one on kind of the reporting landscape. So question from the audience: how are there potential differences in the international reporting landscape with different national legislation expected in different countries? How does that impact, company decisions around carbon credit strategy? And that's for the group. So whoever wants to take it, feel free to jump in.
I can take a stab at that one. It's a good question. And if I'm interpreting correctly, we're talking about the misalignment on timing and coverage, and sometimes even contradictory signals from different jurisdictions. What is the right time? Is it now? Is it in 5 years for an organization to build up a plan and start disclosing their plan of using carbon credits? And I think what Natalie explained just now on a systematic approach that Cisco took after having already made a decision to engage with the voluntary carbon market is probably a really great way of illustrating just the amount of work that needs to be done once you have made that decision, whether it's driven by delivery on customer value, it's driven by regulation, driven by the intrinsic need to act on climate based on science, whatever the motivation is. I think the reality is it takes work to understand the availability, the technology readiness, the inherent risk exposure of different project types mapped to the company's risk appetite. And there's even complications in the contracting side of being part of the voluntary carbon market. And all of that takes muscle memory. And while there's asymmetry or faster and slower moving parts of the world, the decision to act now and start to build those muscles are good, no regret moves. Right? And I think there's a good parallel in the other part of climate disclosure around CSRD. Right? There's the omnibus bill and stop the clock, and we're all running around telling our clients and compatriots in the climate world that stop the clock doesn't mean stop the work. Right? Companies are, as far as I can tell, doing a lot of work behind the scenes. Right? Maybe they're not the loudest in communicating the most ambitious part of their forward-looking strategy. There's plenty of work going on, even though there's a stop the clock going on the type of non-financial climate information that organizations are being asked to put out into the public domain. So I think that's perhaps a good parallel, is to recognize the work that needs to be done, the importance of starting early and build muscles and start to connect your sustainability team, the finance team, those critical internal decision makers, as well as historic carbon offset buyers in the business, those who have been buying credits for events that you're sponsoring, and making sure we're all speaking the same language, have the same understanding on the risks and drivers in the VCM. Hopefully that at least partially answers the question.
Thanks, Yue. Matt or Natalie, no worries if not, but anything else you want to add to that?
I think Yue captured that pretty well. The only thing I might add is, I think, at least when we think about it from a corporate standpoint, right, like we just don't want to be in a position where we're caught on our back foot, right? So I think it's exactly like what Yue said, right? Like just keep flexing that muscle, keep building that internal knowledge base, keep having those conversations with your executives, right? Like usually the first time they hear the topic is not the first time they're giving you some, multi-million-dollar check, right? So make sure you're continuing to build those relationships, and so that when you feel like, hey, we're in a position where we think regulation's changing quickly, but we found a project with a developer that we think is, doing impactful work, that you've already built that baseline trust between your teams in sustainability and in finance.
Fantastic. Okay, we got a lot of good questions, so we're just going to move on here. Again, this is for the whole group. Whoever wants to take it, maybe Matt, you'll take this one. What are the typical motivations we see for companies looking to engage in the voluntary carbon market? I know, Matt, you covered that a little bit. So do you want to start, and then others can chime in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think some of this goes back to different priorities and ambition at organizations. So some companies may have near-term carbon neutrality targets that they are trying to pursue, and that's driving a near-term need for high-quality carbon credits. And others may have a net zero roadmap and want to compensate for their interim emissions in the near term as well, to make other types of claims and go above and beyond just their value chain and such. So I think that's one element, but then there's also other drivers for engaging now and today are again, I mentioned how it's not just about carbon. This also addresses other commitments around things like biodiversity, human health, et cetera. There are other objectives that companies may have, and carbon offsetting projects can support those initiatives as well. And I think, just to piggyback off what Yue has mentioned before, we're seeing motivation to start now because some companies are realizing that if they don't start now, then they're going to be at risk in the future to meet their goals, and they can't just sit on their back feet and wait for the time to come. They need to get the reps, they need to practice, they need to make sure that they secure the credits that they need to achieve their goals. Those are just a few of my thoughts.
Yeah, I'm sure there are tons of motivations, right? And it probably differs per company, but I think there's some common denominators there. Natalie and Yue, anything to add there? Cool. I think Matt probably covered that pretty well. Okay, let's move on to another. So this is for EcoAct, for for Matt and Yue. So what do you think of the argument that fears for greenwashing can only be properly addressed by making a clear distinction between removals and avoidance, instead of talking about carbon credits, which encompass both? Avoidance has the inherent struggle of proving you didn't do something leading to avoided emissions, instead of proving that you did something, namely removing carbon? Matt or UA?
I guess I can start. I think this again goes back to the point that we've mentioned before about driving transparency throughout. Being very clear in why you are offsetting, how you are offsetting, the types of projects and questions that you are trying to address and such. So I think that's one element. But then also keeping in mind that I think there is a place for both of these types of credits. There are some frameworks like SBTI where to make your net zero claim, they require you to use carbon removal credits. There are other frameworks out there that are more agnostic. You can use avoidance and removals. The Oxford Principles talk about how, in the near term, avoidance credits are very much a viable option and encouraged for companies to pursue as the removal market scales and grows into the future. So there's this expected transition of avoidance heavy strategies in the near term transitioning to removals as those technologies scale up. And my personal opinion, I think avoidance credits are very important. If we can, I think a good example is forestry related projects. If we can protect a forest and avoid that deforestation, that has immense benefits to that local region, the biodiversity, the climate, et cetera, rather than starting from scratch and planting a whole new forest to remove carbon as it grows. So I think that's one example. And I think this idea of avoiding emissions, there are challenges with proving the additionality and what is your baseline, et cetera. But we are seeing maturity in this space as new methodologies come out. We have things like dynamic baselining and novel methods for quantifying these projects that are coming online. Anyway, any other thoughts beyond that?
That's really well said. I would add that carbon credits are market instruments to realize the benefit of the different pathways, right? Avoidance and removal being the two that we're discussing here. So it's a great question, and I think it's a really compelling argument. It's potentially a slippery slope to insinuate that by saying we can only avoid greenwashing if we just separate them out and not lump them into carbon credits, we're trying to draw a conclusion that avoidance credits are somehow inferior to removal credits, right? And I think transparency here is absolutely the key. And avoidance credits and removal credits should be held under the same light of permanence, additional, real, no double counting, et cetera. And these are the core principles of integrity, regardless of what type of mitigation pathways we're talking about. Right? And Matt gave a really great example on the importance of protecting our existing forest ecosystems as opposed to deforest now or have little care about the need to protect the forest ecosystem and later on just rely on afforestation for removal, for example. Because the SBTI has been so salient in how we think about climate action, we like to think about the endpoint, right? Whether it's 2030 or 2050, we want to see that as zero. And it's really important to care about the area under the line. Right? So each year that we don't reduce enough and don't invest enough capital into the reduction and avoidance is more cumulative emissions that we would have enabled to transmit from the ground of the surface to the atmosphere. And removals only go so far to take the carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere. And when to parallel track the need for high quality avoidance credits and high quality removal credits. So organizations who generally talk about carbon credits as a pool should start to transparently separate where they're investing in the different mitigation pathways, right? Both of which are credible pathways to net zero. One's not inferior to the other. And greenwashing is a risk that can be mitigated by being transparent, by picking high quality credits in both camps. And it's not necessarily weighing more heavily towards one type of pathway over the other.
Fantastic. Yeah, that was a great question. We have another good one here. As executive teams push for cost-effective paths to net zero, how do you make the case for investing in fewer high-quality and often more expensive carbon credits, especially removals priced at $100 a ton, rather than opting for cheaper alternatives just to meet targets? Do you have evidence that external stakeholders value this approach? And how do you communicate the long-term business case for acting now versus waiting for the market to mature? Really good question. Open up to the panel, whoever wants to take that one. Maybe Natalie, since you weren't on addressed in the last question, if you want to take that.
I think for us, it's about a risk portfolio, right? Like we're always talking about risk diversification. It's not different in the carbon removal space, right? Like it wouldn't be prudent in business, right, to go all in on the same type of project in the same geography with the same everything, right? And so for us, it's not so much about how do you say we want to spend, $300 a metric ton versus $12 a metric ton, but about creating a portfolio with a balance and then coming up with almost a blended price where we're like, this is our target price of what we're going to do. It'll be a mix of engineered, of nature in various geographies, various developers, and then, presented as a diversified risk portfolio.
Yeah, thanks. UA or Matt, any additional thoughts there, especially like making the case for the often more expensive carbon credits?
Yeah, I would add that the decision could be dependent on the size of the business and the maturity of the business, right? There are hard to abate sectors. There are hard to abate emission sources. There are a lot of opportunities for the private sector to take a lead and be the catalyst that's needed to unlock all the different mitigation pathways. And it's the prioritization or the sphere within which we're prioritizing can be expanded to include green hydrogen, right? Charging infrastructure. There are opportunities for climate leaders to take a stance and be that catalyst in the whole roadmap towards net zero, inclusive of decarbonization, inclusive of the technology-based carbon removal project types. And it comes down to the overall business strategy and positioning. And I would, maybe this is not an answer to the question, it's blowing the question into a bigger question on pick where there's the most opportunity to make a real impact that otherwise wouldn't be possible, right? And depending on the size of the business, like we're not expecting a small local manufacturing plant to be the leader in the green hydrogen energy portfolio, right? And no one is asking the small manufacturing company on why they're not spending big bucks to be the leader in the movement. And I think the logic here probably also holds for the carbon credit, the voluntary carbon market, where there are opportunities for private sector capital to support the scaling of something that's very nascent. And the burden of so isn't equally fallen on every single business.
Thank you, UA. Matt, any thoughts there? No worries if not. Just want to make sure you get a chance.
No, I'll let us get to the next question. I know we're running short on time here.
Yeah, we are. Okay, cool. This is actually going to be our last question for today. It's actually for Natalie. Natalie, how much do you communicate to employees about the purchasing? How much does that get factored in with executives?
Yeah, that's a great question. Though, I mean, I think as I was talking earlier, right, like we don't see removals and reduction as two separate things, right? They're complementary things that go into our environmental strategy. So we talk about them with employees like we talk about the rest of our sustainability strategy. Internally at Cisco, we do a lunch and learn that we call Sustainability and Snacks, right? That does a bunch of internal topics on sustainability. So not just net zero, but things like circularity, things like packaging, things like PCFs, LCAs. And so, one of those topics that can come up is carbon removals. And again, we go through our quality criteria, right? Like these are the things we are doing. And what's been interesting about that is it often opens bigger conversations within the different employee functions to want to be more involved in this kind of work and to understand their own footprint. So for example, right, like last time we spoke to that, we had a bunch of folks from the events team reach out to us and want to talk more about like, hey, how can I minimize this at events? Does it make sense to buy carbon removals for specific things? And it opened up a whole nother, educational piece about how we can be thoughtful within each of our jobs, even if you don't work in a chief sustainability office, right? But like, where can you embed sustainability into your job function, and how does that connect to the broader picture? And then when we do things like carbon removals, right? Like, how can we be thoughtful about, again, I'm going to keep bringing this back, that Matt made a great point, right? But like, how do we bring that back to geographies that are impactful to Cisco, right? Like places where we have these events, or manufacturing partners, or large operations, right? And how do we be thoughtful about the communities that we're serving when we think about investment? So hopefully that answers your question.
Phenomenal. Thank you for the excellent questions to the audience and for the lively discussion here, Matt, Yue, and Natalie. I just want to point out that Anna in the chat just put a carbon credit survey. I highly encourage you all to take that. It only takes about 4 minutes. The input would be really helpful to kind of see what's working in practice and benchmark industry approaches. So please take a few minutes to check out that survey. That said, that's all the time we have today. Again, thank you for our speakers for a great discussion, and especially big thank you to my colleague, Ambry, for making everything run so smoothly behind the scenes. I appreciate you. If you'd like to rewatch this webinar, the recording will be archived on trellis.net, and our team will email you the link once it's available later today in a few hours. You could also check out the resources on right here. Yep, I just switched the slide. You could check out the resources by clicking on the resources button on your screen. So you could check out a white paper on rethinking net zero for climate solutions companies, and 2 guides, one on transform climate action into business value, and a guide on carbon offsetting strategy. Lastly, if you want to watch more Trellis webinars, visit trellis.net/webinars. That's again, trellis.net/webinars. On behalf of all my colleagues at Trellis and our speakers today, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jake Mitchell. Until next time, have a wonderful day.